Hello, dear students. Today we're going to talk about a very non-European empire, right? An empire, because before that we've been largely talking with, some exceptions. We've been largely talking about what happens when Europeans appear somewhere on a different continent in a faraway country, and what happens when their culture clashes with some other local cultures that have been developing far away from Europe. But what if I tell you that there are other empires that do pretty much the same? And this is the topic that will prove to you that empires are all to some extent alike because they pursue a variety of similar techniques and approaches when it comes to managing their colonial subjects or just subjects that have been recently conquered from non-title nation or non-title culture that is normally dominating the empire. So we're going to talk about Japanese in East Asia. It's a non-Western empire that is one of the greatest examples of what nationalism could lead to, negatively speaking. Japan built its own empire before World War II, right? In that period, after it was opened forcefully and up until the World War II, it has been actively building its own empire, with World War II being the peak of it trying to consolidate the empire, fighting for global significance, for power and influence. So it's consisted of Taiwan, Korea, eventually Manchuria, eastern parts of China, and a variety of different islands in Central Pacific up to Indonesia. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the Japanese expanded their empire to include much of Southeast Asia. From the perspective of its militarists, the people who have been propelling the idea of military conquest being the primary goal of Japanese colonial empire, they believe that the Japanese colonial possessions provided for its national security, right, and provided it with crucial resources for Japanese economy, which of course needed to be developed because Japan needed that for further militarization, right? So it's sort of a vicious cycle. You militarize to become more powerful, then you need resources for that. You expand to get those resources, then you use your resources to get more military, then you use that military to expand even further. And that's a never-ending cycle until somebody stops you, somebody big enough. But the Japanese also claimed their empire brought progress and modernization to its colonies outside the negative effects of the Western imperialism. Japanese saw themselves as bringing enlightenment to their subjects because they kind of perceive themselves as an alternative to the horrible, corrupting influence of the Westerners that have come to states like China and have taken them down from the pedestal, back to the dirt, and have shown that the Europeans are the bosses here and created colonies where sovereign states used to be. And in that sense, Japan has evaded becoming such a colony, and they perceived it to be a symbol of sorts. Just like, a long time before that, the Japanese have seen the winds that have sank the ships of the Mongols as also sort of a divine symbol, and we call it kamikaze, right? So I'm going to get to that a little later. So, and much like the course of the colonial policies of European powers that we already kind of talked about, Japan's self-interest and sense of superiority overwhelmed its civilizers' Pan-Asian mission and brought around great tragedy in the process, with a lot of violence, people being killed, maimed, tortured, raped, and etc. The Japanese highlands represent a very unique situation in the history of cross-cultural encounters because until 1853, since the 1640s, Japan and its government pursued a strict policy of isolation from the rest of the world. Its officials closed the border to all Westerners except for one Dutch ship a year, which could land at the southern port of Nagasaki, and had to avoid any contact with the locals. Therefore, the Japanese were one of the few nations in the early modern period that sought to be to greatly limit the cross-cultural encounters with anybody, not just the Westerners, anybody, right? And we kind of talked about this a little bit before, right? It was exact consequence of the Europeans getting there and trying to expand and leverage their influence, and the Japanese acting with suspicion, and the shoguns deciding that the European influence and presence is no longer wanted or desired, right? So, and this sort of suspicion has risen into this isolationism, which ironically was the period of the most stability for Japan that was constantly torn by civil wars, constant fighting, daimyo versus daimyo, and and a never-ending cycle of vicious violence. Um, and this is the period where the shoguns finally realized what they need to do to centralize the power, to keep the daimyos at bay, and to make sure the commoners or samurai or anyone out there or the religious sects would stay in line and avoid any sort of violence. While still retaining this one Dutch ship a year, mostly for intel purposes, right? Mostly to collect intelligence on European countries and the state of affairs in Europe to know where, when to expect and where to expect the Europeans to come from with horrible intentions as they typically come with those. In 1853, rapidly expanding United States of America have put an end to this isolation pretty much by accident. They sent military ships to forcefully end the isolation, making the leadership sign a highly unequal trade treaty. Japanese people and the Japanese government, most of all, answered with an aggressive campaign for modernization, right? They didn't want to trade. They said, no, we're in isolation, go away. And then the United States of America never know how to take a no for an answer, right? So they came back and with few ships have put Japan on its knees, right? And it was a clear message. Guys, even though we enjoyed almost 200 or more than 200 years of pure development and peace, we're dragging behind in development and technology. That's not good, right? This is a threat to us, to our very existence. It brings around what we were scared of. So because the United States of America were bound by the Monroe Doctrine, and this idea that Europe deals with the old world and you guys don't go into our Western Hemisphere and we kind of divide the spheres of interest. They didn't colonize Japan, and Japanese were very lucky that the Americans never did this, didn't conquer it, didn't do anything with that, right? Just a trade treaty, even though they have won a military conflict, right? Very, very, very swiftly, with very few resources wasted on that. So, and Japanese took it to heart, right? The Japanese understood and realized the amount of risk that abstaining from development had and started to build up industries, primarily aimed, of course, at raising military might, because the first and the foremost, the most important goal was to be able to fend off any attack that comes your way. For that, of course, a country like Japan needed resources. It's an islander nation with very few sources of iron of very low quality. And I'm not even talking about coal and other things that were essential back then. So hence the expansionism as a driver of foreign policy, something that we see in kind of similar when it comes to Italy and Germany as well, right? Even though Japan was a state, right, it didn't have to unite into the sovereign state all of a sudden late in time, but it had its own factors that have put it on the similar position, on the similar position in the world map, I mean, right, in the international structure. So how did it acquire an empire? Because it's not a very big country, it didn't have a huge population, but it became an empire, right? At least it started at imperial endeavors after the takeover of Ryukyu Islands in 1870s from China. And it accelerated when Japan won two wars on the Asian continent. First one was Sino-Japanese, right? And it was fought in 1894 up to 1895, so just 1 year. And the Russian-Japanese war that also lasted 1 year, just exactly 10 years later, from 1904 to 1905. Both of these empires that used to be dominant in this part of the world have lost to Japan, the new contender for regional dominance. And since the Japanese continued their expansion, since then they continued their expansionism in the region, and particularly into the Chinese territories, most and foremost, and have taken Korea, which was for a significant time protectorate over the Russian Empire, and Russia really wanted Korea to become the territory of Russia, right? They have been dreaming about the Korea becoming just another piece in the Russian Empire. Japan's encounter with the rest of Asia came around when nationalist ideologies became very powerful worldwide. So it's not just Japan. The basis of nationalism in the 1800s and 1900s was ethnic and linguistic unity. and those not belonging to the identity, this title, this dominant identity, often face severe discrimination, hence the fate of the Jewish people, hence the fate of the Roma people, etc. Right? And because of Japanese very homogeneous ethnic makeup, ethnic purity was emphasized within its empire, and Japanese nationalism made them feel superior, rightful rulers of the Asian nation, superior to anyone else. And their nation literally was perfect for that sort of ideology. So this is how it is depicted by the Japanese, the brave Japanese sailors are sinking Russian ships, the image of the Russian-Japanese war by a Japanese painter. I would go on to the next picture to see that the Russian painter has obviously done a different job depicting Japanese as first very short, as you can see, right, and running away from the noble Cossacks, noble cavalry that is running them down, right? As you can see, ideology was booming back then, right? Same thing with the depiction of surrender of the Chinese generals and the fall of Beijing. As you can see, the Chinese here all look very, very cowardly, poor, beaten, etc. Right? So no offense to anybody who associates themselves with the Chinese people. And the painter has depicted the Japanese people as, very manly, ready to jump into a fight right here and there, right? And absolutely fearless. So as you can see, again, depicted in a very particular manner. So Japanese policy when it comes to territories that they take was quite, it was changing through time. And the more successful they became with this acquisition of territory, the more dreadful the policy and the stricter the policy became. Japanese started by pacification strategy on the occupied territory, starting with Taiwan. Taiwan wasn't exactly what it is today. It was sort of an island that nobody cared about all that much. It had some portion of the population with the local people that they're not particularly mainland Chinese, and then have that culture, right? And also some real deal Chinese people as well living there. The pacification strategy often meant executions without trial, as well as numerous tortures, rape, and various other forms of violence and exploitation. But while thinking of locals as inferior, colonial administrations adopted the idea of gradualism, slowly but steadily indoctrinating the population into Japanese language, culture, through education, dress code, etc., songs, popular culture, etc. Since it started in Taiwan, no surprise that right now, even until this day, Taiwanese feel themselves to be very separate from mainland China, culturally, historically, etc. Doesn't just have to do with the Civil War. So in that sense, they've seen these people that weren't exactly super developed in terms of their culture, they have a sophisticated state and society. They were like, we can shape them into the Japanese people, right? Into the right kind of Pan-Asian identity, which of course would be based on the Japanese culture. Japanese policy in Korea is the place where that policy, where that idea of trying to indoctrinate them and to rebuild them, to erase their own national identity, to rebuild them into this more appropriate Japanese identity actually peaked, right? So, and like Taiwan, Korea were always on the radar of the Japanese emperors and shoguns. They previously have attempted, several times they've attempted to fight and conquer Korea, but they weren't exactly successful. And in the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, Korean peninsula was in so much disarray and over the brink of the Civil War itself. So the military success of Japan over Russia solidified the dominance of Japanese over Korea. Japanese envisioned its role in Korea as a constructive one, stabilizing and securing Northeast Asia while bringing progress and modernity to Korea outside of Western imperialism. The Koreans, who back then were quite often called hermit kingdom because they didn't really want to participate in any of the global affairs and kind of secluded themselves to their own peninsula, saw Japanese annexation of Korea quite differently. Protests broke out, but all of them subdued with violence. So we're talking about 1910. It was formally annexed at this period, right, this year, and for the next 9 to 10 years, Korean Christians became the primary resistance against the colonial Japanese forces, because literally what the Japanese represented was to significant distaste of this people, absolutely against all of their ideas and values. For this period of time, Christians all over Korea were rigorously hunted and prosecuted on account of allegedly plotting to murder the Japanese governor. And all of that, even though, considering that there are Christians at this moment in time in Japan, perfectly legal Christians. On March 9, 1919, the Korean king Gyeongju has died, right? So the person who was technically the embodiment of that colonial domination of the Japanese, because he, basically the Japanese emperor was controlling the country through this weird connection, right? That King Gyeongju was basically his inferior to him. So that caused Koreans to release a declaration of independence. We're not a monarchy anymore. We do not want to be part of your empire then, right? Because again, the king is dead. We're a new kingdom. You guys don't have any business here. Thousands of people marched onto peaceful demonstrations all over the country, and the Japanese reacted with pure violence, ignoring the peaceful nature of the protest. Over the next few months, 2,000 Koreans were killed, 20,000 arrested, 3,500 Christians rounded up, 14 Christian churches destroyed, and much, much more. This incident was basically condemned by the world, of course, because again, most of the people targeted were Christians. So again, for them, there would be easier to get support from all the other Christians around the world, even inside Japan as well, who also condemned the actions of their own state. Japanese were forced to replace the governor general in Korea. They also instituted reforms, gradually giving them some limited autonomies, like military police were substituted with the civil police. Limited freedoms of press was instituted. Women were allowed to have their voices heard, and just a little more. But this milder policy ended in 1930s after Japanese military pursued expansion into Manchuria and northern China. So the more successful they became in their conquest, the more aggressive they became in their policies. A new policy of forced assimilation to Japanese culture was introduced, which sought to erase completely any Korean people's sense of their own culture heritage. And they've done it through several directions. For instance, the independent newspapers were closed and replaced by Japanese government-sponsored newspapers to control media narratives. And the schools, that's another track, schools and education. In the schools, they were teaching just Japanese language. And Korean was reduced to an elective and sometimes not even taught in some of the schools at all. So, another thing is language, right? Language is very important for a nation. Nation without its own language has significant concerns about, who we are. Right, so Korean history was removed from the curriculum at all. So not knowing who you are, where you come from, national history is also a fundamental piece of national identity. It is impossible to have one if you don't know who you are, if you don't have common history of your own people, codified history of your own people. So again, what they wanted them to study then is the Japanese history, right? And all the Korean history books, it wasn't an elective. They were just seized and destroyed because they taught a different story about what Korean people are. And that wasn't even allowed, right? So they were again expected to bow before the portraits of the emperor. They rewrote the songs. The Japanese rewrote the songs to praise the emperor, right? Korean families were also required to worship at Japanese Shinto shrines and convert to normal Japanese, traditional Japanese faith. And colonial government even encouraged Koreans to change their family names to Japanese ones. And even popular songs, as already mentioned, have been praising Japan and Japanese emperor. Assimilationist policies in Korea became the most strictly enforced within the Japanese empire, in part because of the ferocity of Koreans' resistance to the Japanese rule. And here the idea is very simple. We guys have come here to civilize you. Why do you, the younger brother, why do you resist our great noble efforts? Because we waste so much money on you, we waste so much effort, and you are unworthy, you are ungrateful, right? And this is why we're going to be stricter to you. This is a picture of Japanese language being taught in a Korean school. Everybody is being, dressed also in a Japanese manner. During World War II, Koreans experienced even greater acts of repression. They were conscripted in the Japanese army, shipped in large numbers to Japan to be forced laborers at the factories, and also, the army participation in the army was also forceful, and you could not say no to. You were basically considered to be frontline infantry, right? And basically dead meat for them. So Korean women, on the other hand, because again, Japanese society is very, very chauvinistic and male-oriented, masculine, that women there basically had very little rights. And like normally in Korea, which wasn't exactly the role model for women emancipation, but still. So Korean women were forcefully conscripted to military brothels as maids of relief, and they were for free use by the Japanese military, which is horrible, of course. Many Koreans, along with the prisoners of war, many nations died from horrible medical experiment or in concentration camps. Most Koreans responded to the assimilationist policies and the wartime repression with renewed nationalism. For them, that was the clear sign: we are not Pan-Asian, we are not Japanese, we don't have anything in common with you guys, we don't like you, right? We want to be a separate, independent nation. We know who we are. We are the people of Korea, and linguists standardized the Korean writing system in the 1930s as a way of supporting the Korean language. They made sure that people could know how to speak their own language. Underground history texts focusing on Korean history were widely circulated. Korean elites sponsored newspapers and associations in the United States of America were peddling anti-Japanese narratives to get more international support. And however, not all Koreans, of course, resisted the Japanese rule. Some of them answered with assimilationist policies, with trying to work, collaborationists trying to work with the regime, quite often taking the Japanese names, and quite often being instrumental in repressions of their own Korean people, right? However, with the end of Japanese rule in 1945, due to their loss in the World War II, Korean collaborators were prosecuted in the next 5 years as criminals of war, and and a good portion of them were sentenced to death, right? Japan and Manchuria. So China is another example of how horribly can imperialistic expansion go, despite any claims to have any civilized mission. Perhaps, again, the worst manifestation of Japanese nationalism happened here in China. And again, as Koreans, Chinese very much dislike Japanese people because, of that. In 1931, Japan expanded its empire from Korea to include Manchuria in the aftermath of the so-called Manchurian incident. That's a very simple tactic. When the Japanese basically, the army covertly blew up a small portion of the railroad that they technically controlled, and blamed it on the Chinese bandits, although the road wasn't in use anymore. It was just some absolutely useless piece of railroad. It was a pretext enough to create a manufactured outrage in the society, and it served as an excuse to launch a full-scale invasion of Manchuria in northern China. Manchuria was proclaimed an independent country and named Manchukuo, right? I hope I pronounce it correctly, guys. I'm struggling with this every time. I've written this, and I've read it for 3 years already. This course still gives me trouble. So they've created this puppet state, and technically it was supposed to be independent, but in reality it was nothing more than a Japanese colony, because all the political decisions, everything has been done through the Japanese efforts. So Japan's attitude towards China had been shaped over the centuries, to be fair, and their encounter with the Chinese has been quite profound historically, because the only reason why Japan has any culture is because China has given them one, and the Koreans were graceful enough to be intermediaries in that process and have transferred that culture to the Japanese very, very long time ago. This is why Japan has a similar writing system to the Chinese, has Chinese Confucian ethics, and the city design of Chinese ancient capital Xi'an has influenced the design of Kyoto, the former capital, the historic capital of Japan. In 20th century, however, China became weakened and dominated by Western interests. Particularly the British are to blame for it, because they have been leveraging their influence in the region quite significantly, especially when it came to the trade with Chinese. While Japanese were never colonized, they've seen that the Chinese that proved to be weak in their eyes because of subduing to the Western influence. So the Japanese started to refer to China in this derogatory manner, Shina, right, rather than a more respectful Middle Kingdom. And China, this former Middle Kingdom, this former dominant force of the region, was to become the crown jewel of their empire. And they explained it by the weakness or backwardness of this people that were plagued by constant decades and decades, hundreds of years of trade and connections with the Europeans that have basically dissolved these people into something lesser, lesser versions of themselves. So the Western hegemony, they were perceiving it to be the reason for the Chinese downfall, and the Japanese were like, we're going to rid them from this, from the Western hegemony. We're going to rid them from this plague. So in Manchuria, the Japanese encountered a wide variety of different people, including aristocratic anti-communist Russian refugees, local farmers and herders, over 29 million Chinese people who comprised the vast majority of the population, also Koreans as well, because Korea was kind of close, and a lot of people who didn't want to be under the Japanese rule just resettled to Manchuria. Japanese settlers also came in great numbers to Manchuria after the Manchurian incident because of the state campaign that was launched. That was promising vast amounts of lands, bountiful, beautiful lands, compared to very scarce territories the Japanese people had on the islands. That was supposed to be, a blessing in disguise. But not that many of the Japanese decided to come, only 200,000, which is nothing, right? Because, again, we're talking about a society that was very nationalistic and didn't really want to leave this perfect land, the perfect homeland. Moving on, in the aftermath of the Manchurian incident, Japanese administrators moved quickly to set up the puppet state and took steps to place all non-governmental organizations under their immediate control. Like Koreans in Korea, the Chinese protested against the Japanese presence, and that was eventually expressed at the May 4th movement of 1919, which began when a group of 3,000 Chinese university students marched through Beijing in protest. Later, the students and a few of their professors issued a manifesto for change advocating morality in politics, democratic governance, social reform, political activism, modern educational system, and women's rights. Everything that, in their opinion, was exactly the opposite of the Confucian ethics that have been the foundation of the Chinese state at the time as well, right, as way before, because they've seen that the governmental elite, the only thing they do is build new palaces for themselves. They bathe in money while the country is starving, and is being actively sold to the West, to the Westerners and to the Europeans. Many university students turned against Confucianism simply because of that, and they have found a new ideal in the Western philosophy of Karl Marx. The Communist Party was established in China during the midst of a revolutionary social and political ferment brought about by the Japanese occupation of Shantung, and that was, again, with the May 4th movement. At least the legend tells us that young Mao was one of those students, very young and, very, very active at this moment in time already. So all this leads us to the Sino-Japanese War and the rape of Nanking. In 1937, the Japanese army penetrated into North China and drew close to Beijing, which led to a full-scale war, basically. So they annexed, right, some territories, and then they decided that's not enough, and they moved onwards to take the entirety of Manchuria, moved to Beijing, and there's a war. The Chinese were fighting with fierce resistance, which shocked the Japanese, especially in Shanghai, and the general strong anti-Japanese sentiments have caused these Japanese soldiers who've been poisoned by the ideas of nationalist supremacy. It made them think that they were allowed, that was justified to commit widespread war crimes against humanity, against the Chinese people, basically a genocide, right? And that went up to its peak when they entered Nanking. The resistance of the Chinese to the Japanese military advance in 1937 has outraged the Japanese, who felt that they've been backstabbed by their wayward brother. They believe that they're going to be welcomed as liberators from the Western colonialism, but it turns out that they, nobody wants them here, and they're hated. So that caused an understandable reaction of the people who have been poisoned by those ideas of national supremacy. The Japanese entered Nanking in December 13, and the atrocities that followed lasted for about half a year. And up until this day, they're known as the Rape of Nanking. Don't Google it, because there is photo evidence, unlike many other things in history, and it's going to be horrible. There's been mass rape of Chinese women, massive killing of Chinese civilians, massive tortures, and just in general, a reign of terror against the Chinese population. These atrocities continued at a very high intensity until June 1938, according to the eyewitness account of minor surveys. Um, this is just Chinese people who are suspected in aiding Chinese military are being executed on the spot. So just caught and executed. Doesn't matter. No trial. Doesn't matter if they really did or not. It served the purpose of putting people into this state of absolute fear. Historical writing about the rape of Nanking is a flashpoint of tensions in East Asia because historians like Iris Chang dramatized Japanese atrocities in her book called The Rape of Nanking, The Forgotten Holocaust of World War II, which I read when I was just a teenager. It was published in 1997, has given me a great amount of things to consider and think about. And in the book, she exposed the Japanese atrocities and argued that they've produced over 1 million deaths, which is horrible, right? It's like, Jesus Christ, that's a good portion of World War II. In this sense, it is interesting that the only reaction on the side of the Japanese right-wing revisionist historians is making an argument that there was no such thing as the Nanking Massacre. It was concocted by Chinese and the Westerners to discredit Japan, which is a narrative so frequently used by all kinds of dictators, tyrants, and psychopaths, right? So, it's not us, it's your own people killing themselves just to make us look bad, right? Yeah, because that's how it works, right? Although Chang's numbers, they cannot be properly evaluated. Some more rigorous historians have narrowed it down to about 200,000 or 300,000 murders, so people literally dead, which is already, that's enough. It's more than enough. That's a horrible amount. It's like a small town absolutely wiped by everybody killed. And 1 million is actually casualties, including rapes, tortures, and maimings in general. The book offers strong evidence of Japanese rape and murder, and has become very influential. While ironically, the Japanese revisionists have very little credibility, and no one in their right mind would be supporting them because that would be pure ideology. Despite the obvious, the Japanese government has tried to downplay the incident. Government-approved school textbooks even today refuse to acknowledge the full extent of the atrocities and refer to it as Nanking incident, as it, oops, as an oops, something happened, not our fault. Wasn't intentional, and it neutralizes the significance and avoids the correlation with the official government. Many of people in this government have ties, through their relatives, through their predecessors, have ties to that Meiji government. The Japanese reluctance to properly acknowledge a genocide and take responsibility for numerous victims of its empire building have inflamed the public opinion in Asia and produced massive protests in China and elsewhere. Korea, it will be in Indonesia, it will be in a variety of different places. Japan's aggression during World War II has generally made the relationship in the region very tense and very unconstructive, right? Because it's all about hating the Japanese, right? All of a sudden. So people from Korea, Philippines, Malaysia, China, Indonesia find it very difficult to reconciliate with Japan, specifically because Japan doesn't acknowledge its own guilt in that. So this is the Japanese boycott in Korea. Again, Korea with a lot more people in the picture. You can see different groups of people, from young women, young people, young girls, to older women and older males. So literally everyone is there, right? Same thing, right? Shinzo Abe, former prime minister. And if we look at the Chinese examples, similar things, just a lot more people and maybe just less, streets are less clean, there's a lot more construction happening, but pretty much the context is the same. I mean, this is already something that tells you all about the things that you need to know about their attitude towards Japan. So the people stepping on Japanese flags, tearing them apart. Some absolutely unimportant place that serves food in China would say Japanese people not allowed, not served, so stay away. And you might say, how's the murder of Prime Minister Shinzo Abe just several years ago connected to this? The murder of this former Prime Minister of Japan happened in 2022, well after him retiring from the post. Abe was assassinated while giving a speech at Nara. He was shot by a homemade firearm, which makes it even more shocking to the Japanese people that doesn't have firearms circulating all that much, so there's not a lot of gun violence over there. The assassin was identified as Tetsuo Yamagami, And uh, Abe was struck by gunfire, later pronounced dead in the hospital. This event marked a significant shocking incident in Japan, and people reacted with shock and grief. But in China, Korea, and elsewhere, people were, very joyful. They were overwhelmed with glee and happiness because Abe was a descendant of a colonial official in Manchuria. His grandfather was known to be behind questionable decisions, and again, Abe being anti-China, right, and pro-Western in a lot of ways, and quite a significant conservative and a nationalist, was uh, somebody that people didn't really like and have seen the horrible, previous horrible wrongdoings of Japan to be, him to be the embodiment of that. So the conclusion here is very simple. The Japanese encounter with other Asian ethnicities was conflictuous and violent, and just like with every other European empire that we've seen, or any other empire, maybe with the exception of Ottoman Empire, right? All of them, the more successful they become in their conquest, the more reluctant they are to go along with their own civilizers' goal of enlightenment, right? They even, it doesn't matter how actually coherent that goal is, the very idea and dedication is already compromised by their own policies, right? Directly compromised. And I mean, the very idea of forging this Pan-Asian identity and rewriting the culture and the national identity of this people, all of these people, into some Pan-Asian identity based on Japanese culture wouldn't really make them this one great united empire. As Japanese are still, by the way, up until this day, super nationalistic, and they were super nationalistic back then as well, that would only mean that Japanese society would then acquire a certain stratification with the true Japanese people on top, and then everyone else who would want to be Japanese, who would be made to act as Japanese, but wouldn't be good enough to be proper Japanese because they weren't born, their skin color is different, they don't look properly, or they have an accent, or something else, right? In this sense, that very civilized mission was already having the seeds of its own destruction, put into the ground well before any of that even started. Believing themselves to be unique, the Japanese failed to see that their success to withstand Western colonization was more owed to geographical location and a peculiar phenomenon in history, because they were too far away from anybody who cared enough to come there and conquer them or colonize them. Everybody was busy with more openly profitable territories. And they mistook it for the superiority of their own nation. Korean Chinese and other Asian ethnicities mostly responded resisting the Japanese rule in a variety of ways. And unlike Germany, Italy, anybody who supported the Axis, Japan was never properly denazified and never offered a real apology for Korea or China. Italy is another example, right? So Italy technically broke away from Germany, right? Broke away from Mussolini, and then the kind of Italy fighting for Germany after the second half of the Second World War was not really real Italy, because Italy had a lot of people being against Mussolini, and they finally revolted. And technically, Italy wasn't there until the end of war. At some point, it stopped being part of the Axis. Japan was always part of the Axis until the very end, but it was never properly denazified and never offered a real apology for Korea or China, making reconciliation basically impossible. As a result, conservative nationalism is still extremely popular in Japan as a political ideology, and even liberals are significantly nationalistic and conservative over there. So this is your homework, guys. That's what we are going to discuss when we meet face to face. There's a small reading and 5 questions. If you absolutely dislike question number 5, it is okay. I understand. It is not the best one out there. I'm still, to remake this one, I'm still thinking about what I will do with that one. Out of these videos, I would suggest that most important right now for you to watch would be Meiji Restoration. So this is the one for you to watch, because we deliberately didn't talk about how the restoration into the empire of the Japanese state happened, how the shogun was shifted to, all of a sudden, as a head of state, the role of head of state has shifted to the emperor, right? So that is the video that covers that. So be ready to watch that. Materials from that video, the information in this video will be in your final. So don't forget to watch it. This is it. I'll see you guys next week, or wherever I see you, and we're going to continue with yet another topic. Good luck and see you then.